Modern Vintage Radio.
Welcome to the Podcast Planner podcast. This show is about podcasting with a content creation focus because content matters when you're sharing your voice with the world. Now, what I'm about to share with you in this episode is nothing new, but it's surprising how many podcasters miss this step, or they kind of rush through this, give it a little thought here and there, and then they wonder, why isn't my podcast growing? Why can't I attract the right audience for my show? Well, when you've made the decision to start a podcast, a lot of the advice that you'll get is just start. Grab a microphone and just start recording. Now, there's some truth to that, but I've been there. Many of my podcasting friends have been there. And if you just take a moment to first think of your listener and the content, it will save you a lot of growing pains. Even if you've been podcasting for a while, I believe this series will help you a lot. I'll be taking you through a section from my planner, deep diving into what I call the podcast compass. Creating a podcast compass will have more than just the basic information of your show. It will help you focus on the original goals and interests you intended for your podcast and your audience. So when content creation or growing your podcast gets tough, this compass will guide you from the core set of actions based on your beliefs and ambition. Fun fact, all that I'm sharing with you is packaged neatly inside the podcast planner. It has templates, focus exercises, checklists, and more to help you with your podcast. You can grab 2 free templates when you join the VIP email list, or grab the complete planner. All of this is available by visiting thepodcastplanner.com. Now back to creating your podcast compass. What exactly is a podcast compass? Well, the podcast compass has quite a few important elements. It goes from the basic information of your podcast, like name, category, description, keywords. Then it goes into the other core valuable information, such as your goals, your mission, your ideal listener, and core topics that you can always fall back on. Let's start with the core values of your show. Now, if you don't have the podcast planner, nothing to worry. You can grab a sheet of paper and follow along when you're not driving, walking, or whatever else you do when you're listening to a podcast. Another quick note, as you answer these questions, I highly recommend getting specific as possible. Okay, the first thing to write out is, what is the main goal of your podcast? It's time to get honest and real about why you're taking time to plan, record, and share your voice with others. Writing down, I just want to help people, or I just want to talk about what I'm passionate about. Those are very vague, so get specific. And this kind of reminds me of that whole acronym SMART. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but here's what the letters really stand for. S is specific, to get specific. M is for measurable, and A is for attainable. R is for relevant, and T is for time-bound, SMART. So when you're setting up this goal for your podcast, if you haven't already, or you're revisiting this, it's very important to get specific. Really focus on specific, relevant, and attainable. The other ones we'll get to in the following exercises of creating our podcast compass. So when it comes to your podcast, what is the main goal of your podcast? Get specific, get honest, get real about it. And is it attainable? I guess that's the real part of it, right? Is it attainable? Or is it that star in the galaxy, hard to reach type of thing? Take the time to do that. We'll dive into the other elements of the SMART acronym in the following episodes. I do have a couple other trigger questions to help you when you're creating this goal for your podcast. Question number 1. Are you podcasting to be recognized as a legit artist, entrepreneur, or business? Are you podcasting to journal your journey and want others to join? Those are some questions to get you started on the goal. Now, what about your audience? It may not seem like a big deal to take a moment to think about your ideal listener, but this is an essential piece to your podcast. And taking time to think of your ideal audience is not just a podcast thing. Movies, businesses, and even app creators all go through this little exercise of writing out who is their ideal person, because it helps communicate clearly to who the end consumer is. Whether this is a movie, a business, there's somebody on the other side. It's not just numbers. A lot of the times podcasters continue to look at their stats, but those stats, those numbers represent people, represents a person who's interested in what you have to say. But if you're not really clear about who it is that you're actually talking to, there's going to be a huge disconnection when you're talking about, I don't know, one topic and the person's like, well, I thought this show was about this. Well, never mind. I'm not going to even subscribe. I'm just going to delete it all completely. When you take the time to think about who is listening and who should listen to your show, the listener starts to feel as if you know them personally, and you're talking directly to them. And that's where the conversation starts to happen. In the end, podcasting is having a conversation with your audience, having a conversation on a said topic. So again, get specific on who should be listening to your podcast and why they should listen to the podcast. Creating a story for your listener is cool, but don't feel like you have to get so specific that you're writing down the type of socks they're wearing. I think that's a little overboard. Again, just get specific on who it is and why they should be listening. You can even go an extra mile and write down where you would typically run into this type of listener virtually and in person. So for example, podcasters are typically more on Twitter and Facebook, and then I would run into them at podcasting events or live performances of podcasting. There's quite a few mixed there, but that's just an example or just the tip of the iceberg of where I can find my ideal audience. Now let's touch on the core topics of your podcast. The Podcast Compass is about guiding you. Having these 3 core topics will help you in creating content that aligns with your goals and your ideal listener. So the core topics for this show is planning, recording, and publishing. Those are the core topics that I always dive into when it comes to creating content for this show. So when I look at my content calendar for this episode, I see that I'm diving into the planning topic, deep diving with the Podcast Compass section. You don't have to have 3 core topics. Having at least 1 to 2 is really helpful. 3 is, I don't know what it is with 3, but 3 is kind of a magic number when it comes to content creation and communication, whether it's public speaking, blogging, podcasting, even movies and TV. They all have, for the most part, fall into a category of 3 things. So having 3 core topics to your show will be very helpful, but don't feel like you have to have 3. Maybe you're just typically 1 to 2 core topics, and that's totally fine. Again, just having these things down, having a compass for your podcast is very super helpful. So there you have the core elements of your podcast compass. Number 1, the main goal of your podcast. Number 2, the ideal listener of your podcast. And number 3, core topics of your podcast. This is the core of your podcast compass that will help you and guide you in creating the right content for your show and for your audience. All right, we'll continue to build out our podcast compass by focusing on the more basic but important information of your podcast. Subscribe so that you don't miss out. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Planner podcast. This show is written and produced by Addie Saucedo. That's me. For more episodes, freebies, t-shirts, and the Podcast Planner, head over to thepodcastplanner.com. If you like the show, please tell anyone that is interested in podcasting. You can follow me on social media. Just search Podcast Planner. Since this show comes in a series, you should subscribe to the show to make sure you get all of the episodes. Our supporters are Team Podcast, Spreaker, Podfest, Podbean, Podcaster Society, and Podomatic. Until next time, plan, record, and share your voice with the world.